I am Sloan, 33 years old, and I built a $70 million empire from absolute scratch. I bled from my family business when it was practically bankrupt, transforming a dying trucking fleet into a global logistics powerhouse. But when my father handed me a termination letter in our quarterly board meeting, claiming my lazy brother deserved to be CEO because I needed to focus on finding a husband, I did not cry. I just smiled, signed the paper, and walked out. He thought he could hand my success to his favorite child. But when I walked out with every patent client and key executive, he realized too late that I was the company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. It was a Tuesday morning when my entire life changed. The sky over Chicago was a crisp, clear blue, and I walked into the corporate headquarters of Harrison Logistics feeling like a conqueror. For 5 grueling years, I had poured my absolute soul into this company. I am a supply chain strategist by trade, and when I took over my father's failing trucking business, it was $5 million in debt. The trucks were falling apart, the drivers were quitting, and the bank was threatening to foreclose on everything my father Harrison had ever owned. I stepped up when nobody else would. I worked 80 hours a week, sleeping on a terrible cot in my office, designing a revolutionary inventory and routing software that brought the company into the modern age. I did not just save the business, I transformed it into a $70 million logistics machine. That morning, I held a thick leather folder containing a massive expansion contract. We were about to acquire 2 regional distribution centers, a move that would cement our dominance in the Midwest. I had negotiated the deal for 6 months, fighting tooth and nail for every concession. I expected this quarterly board meeting to be a massive celebration. I expected my father to finally look at me with the pride and respect I had earned through sheer grit and undeniable financial results. Instead, I opened the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom, and the atmosphere instantly suffocated me. The room was dead silent. There was no coffee laid out, no celebratory spread, no projected financial charts on the screen. My father, Harrison, sat rigidly at the head of the long table. He wore his finest navy suit, his hands steepled in front of him, his face devoid of any warmth. But what made my footsteps falter was the sight at the other end of the table. My older brother Cameron was sitting in my chair. Cameron is 35 years old and has never possessed an ounce of work ethic or ambition in his entire life. While I was pulling all-nighters to appease angry creditors and salvage our supply chain, Cameron was playing golf, taking extended vacations to resorts in Florida, and relying on his massive monthly allowance from our parents. He had an expensive business degree that he used as a coaster for his drinks. He had never closed a deal, never managed a crisis, and certainly never cared about the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on our success. Yet there he sat, leaning back in my custom leather chair, wearing a smug, arrogant grin that made my blood run cold. His tailored suit looked brand new, clearly purchased for this exact occasion, paid for by the dividends I had generated. I walked slowly into the room, setting the heavy expansion contracts on the polished wood table. The thud echoed in the silent room. I looked directly at my father. I asked him what was going on, and why Cameron was sitting in the chief executive officer seat. Harrison did not even blink. He reached beside his coffee mug, picked up a thin manila envelope, and slid it down the length of the long table toward me. The paper rasped against the wood and stopped right in front of my hands. I opened the envelope. Inside was a termination and severance agreement. My name was typed neatly at the top, alongside words like immediate dismissal and transition of power. I stared at the harsh black letters, my brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of the document. I was being fired from the company I had completely salvaged and rebuilt. I looked back at my father, waiting for a rational explanation, waiting for him to tell me this was some twisted administrative mistake or a bizarre test of my loyalty. Instead, he cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive tie, and delivered the most insulting speech I have ever heard in my 33 years of existence. He told me that he was exercising his rights as the 51% majority shareholder to oust me from my position as chief executive officer. He said my termination was effective immediately and that security was already informed of the leadership change. My voice was dangerously quiet when I asked him for a reason. I demanded to know how he could legally or morally justify removing the person who pulled him out of crushing debt and generated $70 million in pure revenue. Harrison folded his hands and looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and patriarchal condescension. He told me that I was a 33-year-old single woman who had sacrificed her personal life and happiness for the business. He said it was unnatural and unhealthy for a woman my age to be so obsessed with corporate logistics, shipping routes, and profit margins. According to him, I needed to step down immediately to focus on finding a husband, settling down and starting a family before my time ran out. Then he gestured proudly toward my brother. Cameron, he explained, was a family man. He had a wife and a stable household. He possessed the right traditional image to lead a legacy company into the future. Harrison genuinely believed that because Cameron was a man with a ring on his finger, he inherently deserved the empire that I had built with my bare hands. My father actually said that it was time for the men of the family to take the heavy lifting off my delicate shoulders, so I could finally focus on my true biological purpose as a woman. The sheer disrespect and blatant sexism took my breath away. For a brief, agonizing second, the little girl inside me wanted to scream, to cry, to beg for the unconditional love and validation she had spent her entire youth trying to earn from a father who only saw her as a tool. But the seasoned corporate strategist I had become simply locked that vulnerable little girl away. I felt no tears forming in my eyes. I felt no urge to yell, to argue, or to throw the heavy glass water pitcher across the room. A chilling, absolute calm washed over my mind, replacing the shock with pure, calculated clarity. I looked at Cameron, who was practically vibrating with unearned pride, ready to reap the massive financial rewards of a harvest he never planted. Then I looked at my father, a man so blinded by his toxic favoritism and outdated gender roles that he was willingly handing the keys to a high-performance machine to a man who had never worked a hard day in his life. They thought I was just a placeholder. They assumed I was a temporary worker keeping the seat warm until the golden child was finally ready to claim his unearned throne. They looked at me and saw an obedient, disposable daughter. They had absolutely no idea what I had done to secure my own future, or the catastrophic trap they had just triggered by handing me that piece of paper. Before I could even articulate a response to my father's absurd declaration, the heavy boardroom doors swung open again. The sharp rhythmic clicking of designer heels echoed across the hardwood floor. In walked Naomi, my brother's 31-year-old wife. Naomi, a striking African-American woman with an impeccable sense of style and an insatiable appetite for attention, treated our corporate headquarters like her personal country club. Today, she was dressed in a pristine white Chanel suit, holding her phone high in the air, completely oblivious to the gravity of a corporate board meeting. Or perhaps she was entirely aware and simply did not care. She was live-streaming to her thousands of social media followers, capturing the exact moment of my professional execution for public entertainment. "Hey everyone! Welcome to the new era," Naomi cooed into her phone camera, panning the lens across the expansive room before zooming in on my brother. "Look at my brilliant husband, the new Chief Executive Officer of Harrison Logistics. I am so incredibly proud of him for stepping up and taking his rightful place at the head of the empire." She strutted over to Cameron, planting a kiss on his cheek while ensuring the camera captured his smug profile. Then she turned the lens toward me. I sat there with my hands resting flat on the table, my expression a mask of absolute stone. Naomi offered me a smile dripping with weaponized pity, and a huge shout-out to my sister-in-law Sloane. Naomi announced to her digital audience, her voice laced with condescension. She has been working herself to the bone for years, just an overworked spinster trapped in an office. But today, she is finally free. Cameron is taking over the heavy lifting so Sloane can finally get a manicure, go on a date, and maybe find a man before it is too late. You should be thanking him, Sloane. He is giving you your life back. She lowered her phone, ending the broadcast, and looked at me with genuine disdain. She actually believed the garbage she was spewing. She believed her husband was a corporate savior rather than a glorified parasite. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead for my job or demand respect. Begging is for people who lack leverage, and I held all the leverage in the world. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. The scrape of the chair legs against the floor commanded the immediate attention of everyone in the room. I looked directly into Harrison's eyes, then shifted my gaze to Cameron, and finally to Naomi. "Let us talk about the heavy lifting," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a frozen blade, because clearly the reality of this business has been lost in your delusions. 5 years ago, this company was bleeding to death. You were $5 million in debt, Harrison. The trucks were rusting in the lots. The drivers were striking because their paychecks bounced. The bank was 30 days away from liquidating everything you owned, including the mansion where you sleep. I took a step toward the head of the table. Cameron did not step up to save you. Cameron was hiding in Miami, maxing out the company credit cards on golf trips. I saved you. I worked 80-hour weeks. I fired the incompetent managers. I, personally, negotiated with our creditors to stop the asset seizure. I tapped my index finger against the polished wood of the table. But more importantly, I completely revolutionized our operations. I brought in the proprietary software that streamlined our entire supply chain. I secured the massive logistics contracts that turned this sinking ship into a $70 million enterprise. That revenue exists solely because of my strategy, my software, and my endless sacrifices. I turned to look at my brother, who suddenly seemed much smaller in my oversized leather chair. Cameron does not even know the login password to our primary logistics dashboard. He does not know the names of our top 5 clients. If you put him in charge of this company, he will crash it into a wall before the end of the fiscal quarter. That is enough, Sloane. The harsh, scolding voice came from the back of the room. My mother, Patricia, emerged from the shadows near the executive lounge. I had not even noticed her sitting there silently, watching her daughter be stripped of her life's work. Patricia walked forward, her face twisted into a scowl of deep maternal disappointment. She stood beside Harrison, presenting a united front against me. "You need to stop being so incredibly selfish and dramatic," Patricia reprimanded me, speaking as if I were a petulant toddler throwing a tantrum. "Your father has made his decision, and it is the right one. You are acting like a bitter, jealous child." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. "I am stating financial facts, Mother. Handing a $70 million company to a man who cannot even read a balance sheet is corporate suicide." "You built nothing," Patricia snapped, her voice rising in defensive anger. "This is your father's company. It carries his name. You merely managed the day-to-day tasks. You kept the seat warm until Cameron was ready to assume his responsibilities. That is your duty to this family, Sloane. Your role is to support your brother, not compete with him." Patricia looked me up and down, her eyes full of the same toxic judgment my father harbored. "Look at yourself," she sneered. "You are 33 years old and completely alone. You have no husband, no children, no life outside these four walls. You are a cold, calculating machine. Cameron has a beautiful wife. He has a social standing to maintain. He needs this position to provide for his family's future. You should be apologizing to your father for speaking to him with such profound disrespect. My mother genuinely believed that my lack of a wedding ring completely invalidated my intellect, my work ethic, and my undeniable financial achievements. In her twisted mind, a woman's only valid currency was her marital status. Because I had dedicated my 20s and early 30s to saving them from bankruptcy, I was now a failure in her eyes. I was a spinster who had outlived her usefulness. They all stood there, staring at me. Harrison with his cold authority, Patricia with her toxic maternal judgment, Naomi with her vain superiority, and Cameron with his unearned cowardly arrogance. They expected tears. They expected a breakdown. They expected me to surrender. But I was not going to give them the satisfaction. I was not going to explain that the $70 million in revenue did not belong to Harrison Logistics. I was not going to tell them that the entire operational infrastructure of this business was a house of cards, and I held the only breeze capable of blowing it down. I just looked at my family, realizing I owed them absolutely nothing. I looked at the four of them standing there, united in their deep delusions. My mother with her arms crossed in righteous indignation, fully believing she had just corrected a moral failing in the universe by putting me in my place. My father with his icy, uncompromising stare, convinced he had secured his grand legacy. Naomi, with her phone still clutched in her manicured hand, already mentally drafting her next social media post about her newly minted executive husband. And Cameron, my older brother, practically sinking into my chair as if its expensive leather could somehow absorb my competence and magically transfer it to him. Arguing with them was entirely pointless. You cannot reason with people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding you. You cannot show logic to people who view your very existence as a direct threat to their outdated hierarchy. I felt a profound, exhilarating sense of liberation wash over me. The heavy chains of familial obligation were finally snapping. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my favorite pen. It was a heavy, silver fountain pen I bought for myself the day we crossed the $50 million revenue mark. A massive milestone my father had previously called impossible. I uncapped the pen. The soft click sounded remarkably loud in the quiet room. I leaned over the expansive mahogany table, completely ignoring the hostile glares burning into my skin. I did not bother reading the fine print of the termination and severance agreement. The severance package they were offering was an absolute insult, a tiny fraction of what I was legally owed for my contributions, but I simply did not care. The money outlined in that document was pennies compared to what I was about to take from them. With smooth, deliberate motions, I signed my name on the dotted line. I pressed the silver nib hard enough to leave a deep impression on the page beneath it. I capped the pen, slipped it back into my blazer, and gathered the papers into a neat stack. I slid the heavy manila envelope across the polished wood. It glided effortlessly and stopped right in front of Cameron. He looked down at my signature, a greedy, victorious smile stretching across his face. He actually thought he had won the war. I looked him dead in the eyes, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Good luck, Cameron. You are going to need it." His smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a tiny flicker of doubt registering in his hollow mind as he processed my calm demeanor. But before he could respond, before my mother could launch into another exhausting tirade about respect and duty, I reached into my other pocket. I pulled out my company-issued smartphone, the device that had tethered me to this business for 5 exhaustive years. It had rung at 2 in the morning with warehouse emergencies. It had buzzed during holidays with logistics nightmares. I placed it gently on top of the signed termination agreement. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my heavy ring of keys. These were the master keys to the entire corporate building, the keys to the secure server rooms, the keys to the sprawling freight yards. I dropped the metal ring onto the table. The sharp clatter of the keys hitting the wood made my father flinch. I did not say another word. I turned my back on my toxic family and walked toward the heavy double doors. My posture was perfectly straight, my steps measured and confident. I pushed the doors open and stepped out into the bustling executive hallway. The air outside the boardroom felt immediately lighter. As I walked down the long corridor, I looked through the glass walls of the open plan office. I saw the massive digital maps displaying our active shipping routes across the country. I saw the dedicated teams of analysts and dispatchers working frantically to keep the supply chain moving smoothly. These were the people I had hired. This was the vibrant corporate culture I had built from the ashes of my father's failures. A few employees looked up as I passed, offering friendly smiles or quick waves, completely unaware that their chief executive officer had just been ousted by a nepotistic coup. I did not stop to pack a cardboard box. I did not return to my office to gather personal, framed photos, or my favorite coffee mug, or my desk plants. I wanted absolutely nothing tying me to this physical space. I left my expensive espresso machine, my custom ergonomic chair, and my framed industry awards exactly where they were. They were just meaningless objects. The true value of this company, the massive intellectual property, the vital client relationships, and the actual operational brains were all walking out the door with me. I reached the end of the hallway and pressed the call button for the executive elevator. The quiet hum of the machinery arriving felt like a ticking countdown to their absolute destruction. I stepped inside the stainless steel cab and turned around to face the floor one last time. The elevator doors began to close, slowly narrowing my view of the busy office, sliding shut over the frosted glass logo of Harrison Logistics. The moment the metal doors sealed shut, locking me in private silence, a fierce, unapologetic smile broke across my face. The obedient daughter was officially dead and buried. The ruthless strategist had fully taken the wheel. I reached into my purse and pulled out my personal cell phone. It was completely disconnected from the company servers, a highly secure private line I had maintained for the past 3 years for this exact scenario. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and tapped a name. Gideon. Gideon was my corporate attorney. He was not a friendly family lawyer. He was not a soft-spoken mediator who sought amicable resolutions. He was a legal shark, a man feared in corporate litigation circles across the entire city for his sharp mind and destructive tactics. I had retained his services entirely independent of my father's company, paying his exorbitant retainer fees from my own private accounts. He answered on the very first ring, his deep, gravelly voice, entirely devoid of pleasantries. He simply asked for my status. I watched the floor numbers light up as the elevator rapidly descended toward the ground level. I kept my eyes fixed on the digital display, my heart beating with the thrilling adrenaline of a perfectly executed plan finally coming to fruition. Gideon? I said, my voice echoing slightly in the confined space of the elevator cab. It happened. My father just terminated me and signed the company over to Cameron. There was a brief, highly satisfied hum from the other end of the line. Gideon had predicted this exact sequence of events months ago when we first analyzed my father's erratic behavior and his obvious desperate succession planning for his golden child. I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute magnitude of the moment. I stepped out of the elevator and strode confidently across the marble floor of the main lobby, ready to unleash the storm they had brought upon themselves. Activate Protocol Alpha. 2 days passed in absolute silence. The quiet from Harrison Logistics was completely expected. Gideon needed that 48-hour buffer to file the necessary legal injunctions and finalize the asset transfers under the radar of my father's corporate lawyers. I spent those 2 days resting in my high-rise apartment, drinking premium coffee and watching the Chicago skyline. I felt no stress. I felt no anxiety. I was a predator waiting patiently for the trap to spring. On Thursday afternoon, a notification flashed on my private phone. It was an email from my father, a mandatory summons to a Michelin-starred restaurant downtown. Patricia had booked their most exclusive private dining room to officially celebrate Cameron's ascension to the throne. The email came with an explicit, heavily worded threat. Harrison stated that my attendance was required to project a united family front to our extended relatives and industry partners. If I refused to show up and smile for the cameras, he would contact the corporate bank and freeze my 10% minority shareholder dividends immediately. He thought he held my financial security hostage. He thought the threat of losing those dividends would break my spirit and force me into submission. He had absolutely no idea that those dividends were tied to a company about to hit a catastrophic financial iceberg. I typed a simple one-word confirmation response. I was going to attend. I was not going to appease him. I was going to look into their eyes while they celebrated on the deck of a sinking ship. I arrived at the restaurant exactly on time. I did not wear the exhausted, defeated look they eagerly anticipated. I wore a tailored emerald green silk dress, diamond stud earrings, and a pair of sharp stilettos that echoed loudly against the polished marble floors of the restaurant lobby. I exuded absolute, unshakable confidence. The hostess guided me down a long corridor to the private dining room. The space was dripping in excessive, gaudy luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung low over a massive banquet table, adorned with imported white orchids. Patricia had spared no expense, likely charging the entire extravagant evening to the corporate expense account without a second thought. The room was packed. My aunts and uncles were there, mingling with several high-profile supply chain vendors and local business magnates my father desperately wanted to impress. The moment I walked through the heavy double doors, the loud conversations halted. The silence was palpable. Patricia rushed over, her smile tight and heavily practiced. She grabbed my arm, digging her manicured nails into my skin, and whispered through gritted teeth that I better not cause a scene and ruin her son's perfect night. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm, gave her a flawless, camera-ready smile, and walked past her to take my assigned seat at the far end of the table. Cameron sat at the very center of the table, flanked by Harrison and Naomi. Naomi looked radiant, constantly adjusting her posture every time a server walked by, ensuring everyone noticed her newly elevated status as the chief executive officer's wife. She caught my eye from across the table and offered a smug, dismissive wave. I simply raised my glass of sparkling water in a silent, mocking toast. Let her enjoy her imaginary crown. The dinner service began, and it was an exercise in pure delusion. Course after course of imported caviar, Wagyu beef, and shaved white truffles arrived. The atmosphere was thick with fake laughter and forced networking. I watched my relatives fawn over Cameron, asking him about his brilliant new strategies for the upcoming fiscal year. Cameron answered with vague corporate buzzwords he had clearly memorized from an online business article that very afternoon. Synergy vertical integration, and paradigm shifts flowed from his mouth like a rehearsed script. He had absolutely no idea what any of those terms actually meant in the context of our freight yards, but the extended family nodded along as if he were a visionary genius. As the dessert plates were cleared away by the attentive waitstaff, Harrison stood up. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and tapped it with a silver spoon. The sharp, ringing sound silenced the room immediately. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket, projecting the carefully curated image of a wise, benevolent patriarch passing the torch. He began his speech by thanking everyone for gathering to witness a historic transition in the family legacy. Then he looked directly at me. He told the room that I had done a fair job keeping the lights on during a difficult transition period, phrasing it as if I were a mere receptionist managing the phones while the real executives were busy. He actually thanked me for my clerical assistance. Then he turned his full attention to Cameron. Harrison completely rewrote the history of the last 5 years right in front of my face. He praised Cameron for his brilliant behind-the-scenes strategy. He credited Cameron with the operational overhaul that saved the business from bankruptcy. He looked at the industry partners and stated with complete conviction that the $70 million in revenue was a direct result of Cameron's exceptional business acumen and unparalleled leadership skills. My father stood in a room full of influential people and handed my entire professional legacy to a man who spent the last 5 years working on his golf swing in Florida. He robbed me of my late nights in negotiations and my sheer willpower, wrapping it all up in a neat bow and handing it to his golden boy. The guests applauded loudly, raising their glasses high in the air to toast Cameron. Naomi leaned over and kissed him, beaming with pride. Patricia clapped until her hands must have hurt. I sat perfectly still at the end of the table. I did not flinch. I did not frown. A cold, serene smile rested on my lips. I watched them celebrate a kingdom made of sand, knowing the tide was coming in on Monday morning. As the applause finally died down and the guests eagerly returned to their incredibly expensive desserts, the atmosphere shifted into a more relaxed networking session. People began moving around the long banquet table, refilling their glasses and laughing loudly at my father's terrible jokes. That was when Naomi decided it was time to make her move. She glided past the waitstaff, a glass of vintage champagne in her left hand, and purposefully made her way to my isolated end of the table. She pulled out the empty chair next to me and sat down, leaning in close so I could smell the overpowering scent of her designer perfume. She rested her right hand prominently on the white linen tablecloth. The soft glow of the crystal chandeliers immediately caught the blinding sparkle of a brand-new, oversized diamond watch strapped to her wrist. The timepiece was completely obnoxious, entirely encrusted in heavy jewels, and easily worth more than what our entry-level logistics dispatchers made in a full year. Naomi saw my eyes briefly flick toward the watch, and a deeply satisfied smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. "Do you like it, Sloane?" Naomi asked, holding her wrist up to the light and rotating it slowly, so every single diamond caught a reflection. "Cameron bought it for me this morning, to celebrate his massive promotion. The best part is that he put it right on the company executive expense account. He said the chief executive officer's wife needs to look the part when she attends corporate functions. You know how important optics are in this industry." I stared at the heavy diamond watch. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of charging a luxury jewelry piece to a corporate expense account that I had personally balanced and strictly managed for 5 years was almost comical. She was openly bragging about embezzling company funds on her husband's very first day in office. I simply took a slow sip of my sparkling water. "It certainly is a statement piece, Naomi," I replied, my voice perfectly level. Naomi leaned in even closer, her smug smile hardening into a look of weaponized pity. "You know, Sloane, you really should stop looking so incredibly miserable tonight. This is a blessing in disguise for you. You have spent your entire youth locked in a warehouse, staring at spreadsheets. Look at your skin. It is practically gray from the fluorescent lights. But now that Cameron has stepped up to handle the real, adult responsibilities, you finally have some free time. If you actually put some effort into your appearance and learn to soften your aggressive personality, you might actually find a man who can tolerate you for more than a single dinner date." Before I could even process the sheer venom of her marital advice, a shadow fell over our section of the table. My parents, Harrison and Patricia, had escorted one of our most lucrative regional shipping vendors, an older gentleman named Arthur Sterling, over to my seat. Arthur had worked closely with me for 3 years. He knew my work ethic. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and deep sympathy, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden regime change he was witnessing. "Sloane, my dear Arthur, said gently, extending a hand to me. I was so incredibly shocked to hear the news of your departure. You have been the absolute backbone of this operation. How are you holding up with all of this sudden change? Before I could open my mouth to answer the man, my father forcefully stepped in front of me, physically blocking my line of sight to Arthur. "Sloane is doing just fine," Arthur Harrison boomed, clapping the older man firmly on the shoulder. "To be completely honest with you, this transition was a long time coming. The corporate leadership environment is simply too aggressive and demanding for her. She is a fragile woman, Arthur. The late nights and the high-stakes negotiations were completely destroying her nerves. We had to step in and make a change, for the sake of her own mental health." Patricia immediately flanked my father, nodding vigorously in solemn agreement. It was entirely tragic to watch Patricia added, pressing a hand to her chest in a dramatic display of fake maternal concern. She was buckling under the pressure. She would cry in her office. She simply could not handle the stress of running a company of this massive magnitude. It is a man's world out there on the freight yards, Arthur. We are just so completely relieved that Cameron was ready to step in and rescue her from a complete nervous breakdown. I sat rigidly in my chair, listening to my own parents effortlessly gaslight a key business partner right in front of my face. They were painting me as a weak, hysterical woman who shattered under the very pressure I had thrived in. They were actively destroying my professional reputation to validate Cameron's unearned authority. Arthur looked incredibly uncomfortable, awkwardly shifting his weight and offering a polite, non-committal nod to my parents' fabricated narrative. Right on cue, Cameron strolled over to join the gathering. He held a glass of expensive scotch, swishing the amber liquid around with an air of profound self-importance. He looked down at me, playing the role of the generous, benevolent king, surveying his newly conquered, pathetic subject. "Now let us not be too hard on my little sister," Cameron announced to the small crowd, his voice projecting loudly enough for neighboring guests to hear. "She tried her absolute best. It just was not enough to get us to the next level. But we take care of our own in this family." He looked directly into my eyes, offering me a smile dripping with condescension. "Listen, Sloane. I know losing your salary is going to make things incredibly tight for you soon. You have a lot of expensive habits. If you really need the cash to keep your apartment, I am willing to offer you a low-level consulting job. Nothing too stressful, of course. Maybe some basic data entry or organizing the lower-level filing cabinets. You can work part-time from home. I am happy to throw you a few crumbs to keep you afloat." The surrounding guests murmured in approval, entirely fooled by his performance. They saw a gracious older brother offering a lifeline to a struggling and competent sibling. Naomi beamed at him, resting her diamond-heavy hand on his arm in a show of unified superiority. Harrison and Patricia looked at Cameron with such intense pride, it practically radiated from their faces. They were all waiting for me to break. They expected me to lower my head, accept the humiliating offer, and thank them for their toxic generosity. They wanted me to submit to the narrative they had carefully constructed. I looked at Cameron's smug face, then at the stolen diamonds on Naomi's wrist, and finally, at the deeply deceitful eyes of my parents. I did not blink. I reached out, picked up my heavy crystal water glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I placed the glass back on the table with a firm, solid thud that momentarily silenced their self-congratulatory whispers. "I do not need your charity, Cameron," I said, my voice cutting through the thick atmosphere of the room with absolute freezing clarity. "And I certainly do not need your money. Enjoy your expensive dinner and your new diamond watches. Celebrate while you still can, because the reality of what you have actually inherited is going to hit you very soon, and there will be absolutely no one left to clean up your mess." I stood up slowly, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my emerald silk dress. I did not look back as I walked away from the table, leaving them to their delusions, fully aware that Gideon was already locking the doors to their financial future. As I took my first step away from the table, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung open. The headwaiter entered, carrying a thick, black leather folio containing the massive bill for their extravagant evening. I paused my exit, deciding to linger just long enough to watch the final act of their pathetic performance. For the previous 2 hours, I had eaten my dinner in perfect, calculated silence. I had let them talk. I had let them dig their own graves with every arrogant boast, every fabricated story, and every stolen diamond. I never raised my voice to interrupt them. I never desperately defended my own reputation against their relentless gaslighting. I simply let them build a towering monument to their own fragile egos, knowing exactly how fragile the operational foundation really was. The waiter gracefully approached the center of the banquet table and placed the leather folio directly in front of Cameron. The forced laughter and loud networking instantly ground to an awkward, suffocating halt. Cameron leaned back in his chair and casually patted the breast pocket of his brand-new tailored suit. He patted his side pockets. His smug, arrogant smile slowly dissolved into a look of genuine panic. He looked across the table at our parents and announced loudly that he had conveniently forgotten his wallet in his other jacket. Then, completely predictably, he looked directly at me. For the past 5 years, I was the human safety net for his financial negligence. He fully expected his little sister to quietly open her designer purse, pull out a premium credit card, and silently cover the 5-figure dinner to protect the family image. He actually extended his hand toward me, silently demanding that I step up and solve his problem. I just laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that cut through the dead silence of the room. I adjusted my silk clutch, looked him dead in the eyes, and firmly refused. I told him that as the new chief executive officer, handling massive expenses was now entirely his responsibility. My mother gasped, her face flushing with immediate rage. Patricia fiercely demanded that I stop being difficult and pay the check instantly to save our family from public humiliation in front of the critical industry vendors. I simply turned my back on her and resumed my confident walk toward the exit. The last sound I heard before the heavy doors closed behind me was Cameron loudly and desperately arguing with the unyielding waitstaff as the grand illusion of his wealth shattered in real time. I walked out of the restaurant and into the cool, refreshing air of the Chicago night. I climbed into the leather back seat of my waiting private car. As the driver pulled away from the curb, my phone vibrated in the darkness. It was a single encrypted message from Gideon. Protocol Alpha is fully armed and legally binding. See you Monday morning. I locked the screen and smiled. I knew exactly what Monday morning would look like at the corporate headquarters of Harrison Logistics. I did not need to be physically present in the building to visualize the absolute catastrophe that was about to unfold. I had spent 5 agonizing but productive years designing the entire operational ecosystem of that company, and I knew exactly how it would completely collapse the moment my specific safety measures were forcibly removed. While I was enjoying a peaceful morning in my high-rise apartment, pouring myself a second cup of premium espresso and watching the city come alive, my older brother was driving blindly into the legal and operational trap I had carefully laid for him. Cameron arrived at the main corporate campus at exactly 9 in the morning, which was incredibly late for a chief executive officer in the high-stakes logistics industry, but perfectly on brand for a man who viewed his new title as an honorary crown rather than a demanding, grueling job. He pulled into the executive parking garage in a brand-new, custom-ordered luxury sports car. The vehicle was completely blacked out, obnoxiously loud, and disgustingly expensive. I had absolutely no doubt he had bullied the accounting department into rushing the purchase over the weekend, demanding they use the company credit lines to fund his fragile ego. He parked directly in my designated spot, killing the roaring engine and stepping out into the cool morning air. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, checked his reflection in the tinted windows, and prepared himself for a hero's welcome. In his deeply delusional mind, Cameron genuinely expected a red carpet rollout. He anticipated a grand lobby full of relieved employees eager to shake his hand and publicly thank him for saving them from my demanding high-pressure leadership style. He fully expected the receptionist to stand up and applaud as he confidently walked through the sliding glass doors. He wanted absolute, unconditional validation from the people I had hired and trained. Instead, he walked into a terrifying ghost town. The main lobby on the ground floor was unnervingly quiet. The security guard at the front desk did not stand up to greet him. The guard simply looked at Cameron with a mixture of sheer confusion and deep pity, offering a silent, awkward nod before quickly looking back down at his security monitors. Cameron frowned, visibly irritated by the lack of fanfare and respect, but he pushed aggressively through the security turnstiles and headed straight for the private executive elevator. He pressed the button for the top floor, naively assuming that the real celebration, the champagne, and the congratulatory banners, was waiting for him just outside his new corner office. The elevator doors slid open on the executive level, and Cameron stepped out with a rehearsed, winning smile plastered across his face. But there was absolutely nobody there to see it. The sprawling executive suite was entirely deserted. The motion sensor lights in the long hallways had timed out due to a complete lack of human movement, leaving the corporate corridors bathed in cold, eerie shadows. The massive digital map displays on the walls, which usually glowed brightly with real-time tracking data of our national trucking fleet, were completely black. The desk phones were not ringing. The heavy commercial coffee machines in the break room were completely cold. The ambient productive hum of a bustling $70 million corporate headquarters had been replaced by a deafening, suffocating silence. Cameron walked slowly down the hallway, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly and ominously against the hardwood floors. He called out for the executive receptionist. He demanded someone bring him a hot coffee. He shouted his own name, angrily announcing his arrival, but his voice just bounced off the empty glass walls of the vacant cubicles. A cold spike of panic finally began to pierce through his thick layer of unearned arrogance. He abandoned his slow, majestic walk and started jogging toward the massive mahogany double doors of the chief executive suite. He pushed the heavy doors open and burst into the office. The room was exactly as I had left it on Friday afternoon. My custom leather chair sat empty behind the massive desk. The expensive espresso machine sat unused in the corner. But the desk itself was no longer clear. Sitting perfectly centered on the polished mahogany surface was a massive, neatly organized stack of thick white envelopes. Cameron rushed over to the desk, his hands shaking slightly as he hastily picked up the first envelope. It was marked urgent and highly confidential. He tore it open and scanned the single-page document inside. It was a formal, legally binding letter of immediate resignation from our chief financial officer. The brilliant man who managed every single credit line, authorized every payroll transfer, and held the personal relationships with our most aggressive corporate creditors was walking out the door without a second glance. Cameron threw the paper aside and violently ripped open the next envelope. It was another immediate resignation this time, from our aggressive and highly successful head of sales. The woman who personally managed our top 3 logistics contracts, the massive accounts that generated over 60% of our total annual revenue, had completely severed her ties with Harrison Logistics. He kept tearing open envelopes, his breathing growing rapid and shallow as the sheer scale of the disaster materialized in front of him. The letters just kept coming, one devastating blow after another. The director of human resources, the lead supply chain strategist, the entire senior management team, and worst of all, the complete information technology department. The network engineers and software developers who built and maintained the complex proprietary routing algorithms I had designed to keep our trucks moving had all packed up their desks, wiped their local drives, and vanished over the weekend. Cameron collapsed heavily into my leather chair, staring at the scattered papers in total, paralyzing disbelief. He could not comprehend how this was legally happening. He frantically searched the resignation letters for a logical reason, an explanation, or a list of demands he could somehow aggressively negotiate. That was when he finally noticed the identical legal terminology printed neatly at the bottom of every single document. Each letter explicitly referenced the execution of a keyman clause. When I originally hired my elite executive team, I knew my father might one day try to forcibly remove me to install his golden child. So I protected my people and my operational infrastructure. Gideon, my ruthless corporate attorney, had drafted their executive employment contracts with a highly specific, unbreakable contingency. The key man clause stipulated that if I, Sloan Harrison, was ever terminated, demoted, or removed from my position as chief executive officer without my express written consent, the core executive team had the legal right to dissolve their employment contracts instantly. They could walk away, with no mandatory notice period, fully vested stock options, and absolutely zero non-compete restrictions. I had not forced a single one of them to sign it. I had offered it to them as a powerful shield against my family's toxic nepotism, and they had all eagerly accepted the protection. They were brilliant, seasoned professionals who respected actual competence and deeply despised unearned privilege. They knew that without my strategic direction, Harrison Logistics would quickly crash into a brick wall, and they had absolutely no intention of being in the passenger seat when Cameron confidently took the wheel. Cameron sat entirely alone in the dark, silent office, desperately clutching a handful of legally binding resignations. The arrogant king had finally arrived at his conquered castle, only to brutally discover that the entire army had already defected. The treasury was completely unguarded, and the fortress walls were already beginning to collapse around him. Cameron threw the crumpled resignation letters onto the expensive mahogany desk, his mind racing to find a convenient scapegoat for this absolute disaster. He told himself that these executives were just loyalists, throwing a temporary tantrum, completely replaceable middle managers who were ultimately unnecessary to the grand vision he was about to execute. He just needed to get the daily operations running to prove he was in total control. He confidently rolled my custom leather chair forward, waking up the massive dual-monitor workstation that served as the digital command center for Harrison Logistics. He grabbed the mouse, expecting the screens to instantly display the vibrant, real-time logistics dashboard that governed our $70 million supply chain. He expected to see the complex web of green and blue lines representing our national trucking fleet moving seamlessly across the map. He expected to see the daily revenue counter ticking upward in the corner. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper where he had hastily scribbled down the master administrative passwords he had demanded from the IT department on Friday afternoon. He typed the credentials into the login field and hit enter. The dual screens flickered for a fraction of a second, but instead of loading the proprietary routing algorithms, the monitor snapped to a stark, dead black. Cameron frowned, aggressively clicking the mouse and mashing the keyboard. He assumed it was a simple network glitch caused by the sudden departure of the technical staff. He restarted the entire system, waiting impatiently for the operating sequence to complete. Once again, the login screen appeared. He carefully retyped the password, ensuring every character was absolutely perfect, and pressed enter. The screens plunged into complete darkness again. But this time, a single glowing white text box appeared in the dead center of the primary monitor. It did not display a network error code. It did not ask for a password reset. It displayed two devastating sentences in a cold, unforgiving font. License expired. Intellectual property belongs to Apex Solutions LLC. Cameron stared at the glowing white words, his brain struggling to comprehend the massive legal and operational wall he had just slammed into at full speed. He had absolutely no idea what Apex Solutions LLC was. He thought Harrison Logistics owned every single piece of software, every server, and every algorithm housed in this massive building. He did not know that when I took over 5 years ago, the company was far too broke to hire external software developers. I had built the revolutionary supply chain software completely from scratch, working late into the night in my apartment, entirely off the company clock and using my own private resources. I had legally incorporated my own private technology firm, Apex Solutions LLC, and officially copyrighted every single line of code. I then leased the software license to Harrison Logistics on a month-to-month basis. It was a massive conflict of interest that my father and his incompetent corporate lawyers never bothered to notice, because they fundamentally misunderstood modern technology and completely underestimated my strategic foresight. My termination automatically severed the software lease. I had not just taken the executives, I had surgically extracted the digital brain of the entire $70 million corporation. Before Cameron could even reach for his phone to call our father, the heavy mahogany doors of the suite swung open once again. Harrison stormed into the office, his face flushed an angry, vibrant red. He had bypassed the empty lobby and the silent hallways entirely, focused on projecting his patriarchal authority on the very first day of the new regime. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Cameron, sitting frozen in the dark office, surrounded by discarded resignation letters, and staring at a completely black computer screen. Harrison demanded to know why the executive floor was entirely empty and why the reception desk was abandoned. Before Cameron could even formulate a pathetic excuse, the deafening silence of the office was violently shattered. Every single multi-line desk phone in the executive suite began ringing at the exact same moment. The piercing, chaotic sound echoed off the glass walls. Because the customer service department had walked out and the automated routing systems were completely dead, the massive volume of incoming emergency calls was automatically rolling over to the only phone lines left active on the network: the executive command center. Cameron stared in horror as the digital displays on the phones lit up with hundreds of incoming stacked calls. Harrison lunged across the desk and snatched the receiver off the base, aggressively barking his name into the mouthpiece. Cameron watched as our father's face drained of all color within 10 seconds. On the other end of the line was a furious dispatcher from one of our largest regional distribution centers. The entire shipping network was completely paralyzed. Without my proprietary software running, the digital tracking systems were entirely blind. The warehouses had absolutely no idea which trucks were supposed to be loaded or what freight was scheduled for departure. The digital manifest systems were locked out. Harrison slammed the phone down and instantly picked up another line. This time it was a screaming logistics manager from Arthur Sterling's company, the very same vendor who had attended the extravagant celebratory dinner just 3 nights prior. The vendor was demanding to know why millions of dollars of imported electronics were sitting completely untraceable on a loading dock in Texas, threatening massive financial penalties for breach of contract if the cargo was not moving within the hour. Cameron shakily picked up a ringing phone on his side of the desk. A stranded, furious truck driver was yelling loudly over the ambient noise of a busy highway. The driver was stuck at a mandatory state way station in Ohio. The electronic payment systems embedded in the software, which automatically generated the digital fuel codes and paid the highway toll fees, had instantly evaporated. Our drivers were literally stranded on the side of the road with empty fuel tanks and no way to pay for diesel. The phones just kept ringing, an endless, terrifying chorus of corporate destruction. The massive logistical machine I had built, a machine that moved thousands of tons of freight across the country every single day, had slammed to a violent, catastrophic halt. There were no dispatchers to route the trucks. There were no financial officers to authorize emergency funds, and the digital map that guided the entire empire was locked behind a black screen that belonged entirely to me. Harrison and Cameron stood paralyzed in the center of the chaotic office, surrounded by the screaming phones, finally realizing the true cost of their absolute arrogance. They had demanded the throne, and I had handed them a kingdom actively engulfed in flames. The chaotic symphony of ringing phones in the executive suite must have been deafening, but I was miles away from the panic. I sat comfortably on a plush leather sofa in Gideon's high-rise office, savoring the delicate aroma of an Earl Grey tea. Through the windows, the Chicago skyline stretched out in a serene panorama, contrasting the operational apocalypse I had unleashed upon my family. Right on schedule, my cell phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed my father's personal number. I let it ring 3 times, taking a deliberate sip of my tea before finally answering. I just listened. "Sloan, what in the absolute hell did you do to the servers?" My father's voice exploded through the speakerphone, raw with genuine panic. I could hear the sheer terror in the background, a chaotic cacophony of ringing landlines, and Cameron's heavy breathing. "You need to log in remotely right now and fix this ridiculous computer glitch. The entire national fleet is stranded. Arthur Sterling is threatening a massive lawsuit. Cameron is trying to route trucks manually, but the dispatchers are locked out. Get this system back online immediately before you cause irreparable financial damage." I smiled, leaning back against the expensive leather cushions. I made sure my voice was incredibly calm. "I am sorry, Harrison," I replied, making sure to use his first name instead of calling him Dad. "I am afraid I cannot assist you with any technical difficulties today. As you clearly stated in front of the board on Tuesday, and proudly reiterated to our industry partners on Thursday evening, I am no longer an employee of Harrison Logistics. I am just an overworked spinster who could not handle the stress of corporate leadership. Cameron is the chief executive officer now. I suggest you ask him to utilize that brilliant business acumen to fix the servers." "Do not play games with me!" Sloan Cameron yelled into the background. "This is not a joke. The main screen says the software license is expired, and some company called Apex Solutions owns the system. Just give me the master password. Stop throwing a childish tantrum because you got fired. Give me the administrative codes right now, or Dad is going to have corporate security track you down for cyber sabotage." I looked over at Gideon. He paused his reading and offered an amused smirk. I took another refreshing sip of my tea. "There is no password that will save you, Cameron," I said. "There is no cyber sabotage. There is only a catastrophic failure of your own basic due diligence. Harrison Logistics does not own the digital supply chain software that moves those trucks. You never did. When I took over 5 years ago, this company was $5 million in debt and could not afford a custom logistics infrastructure. So I built it myself, on my own time, with my private resources. I incorporated an independent technology firm named Apex Solutions LLC. I legally copyrighted every single line of advanced routing code." I let the silence stretch for a long moment, letting the crushing gravity of my words destroy their arrogant delusions. Harrison Logistics was merely renting that software from my company on a month-to-month commercial lease. That lease was explicitly contingent on my active employment as your chief executive officer. When you proudly handed me that termination agreement and forcefully ousted me, you legally severed that contract. My intellectual property left the building the exact same moment I did. You did not just fire your daughter, Harrison. You evicted the digital brain of your entire corporation. "Sloan, you cannot legally do this," my father stammered. "You built that software under my roof. It belongs to the family legacy. You have to turn it back on, right now." "I do not have to do anything," I countered smoothly. Gideon ensured the software lease was absolutely ironclad. Your corporate lawyers were too incompetent to read the fine print. I own the machine. However, because I am a reasonable businesswoman, I am willing to offer Harrison Logistics a new licensing agreement to restore your access and get your fleet moving again. How much Cameron demanded, instantly pure desperation bleeding into his voice. Just tell us the annual fee so we can wire it. It is not an annual fee, I replied coldly. The new licensing agreement is a strict month-to-month contract. Because you are now considered a highly unstable enterprise with no competent executive leadership, the premium has drastically increased. The new fee is $2 million a month, paid entirely upfront in cash before I even consider pressing the button to reactivate your screens. $2 million a month, my father choked out, sounding as if he were physically suffocating. That will completely bankrupt the company in less than 3/4. We do not have that kind of liquid capital sitting around. You are intentionally trying to destroy us. I am simply charging market rate for emergency corporate salvation, I stated, entirely unmoved by his panic. You wanted the heavy lifting taken off my delicate shoulders, Harrison. You wanted Cameron to lead the legacy into the future. Well, now he can. If you cannot afford my software, I highly suggest Cameron utilize his expensive business degree, roll up the sleeves of his custom-tailored suit, and grab a pen and a lot of paper. Because you have 500 trucks stranded across the country, and he is going to have to route every single one of them by hand. I did not wait for a response. I did not want to hear their pathetic excuses, their empty threats, or their inevitable descent into total despair. I tapped the red button on my screen immediately, ending the call and cutting off their lifeline forever. I set the phone down gently on the polished glass table and looked out at the beautiful city below me. The trap had flawlessly snapped shut, and I had finally, undeniably, won this war. The dial tone echoing in that dark office must have been the loudest sound Harrison had ever heard. Instead of recognizing his massive miscalculation and figuring out how to scrape together the $2 million to save his dying empire, my father did exactly what a malignant narcissist always does when backed into a corner. He completely rejected reality. He fell into a blind, highly destructive rage. I did not need to see his flushed face to know he was likely smashing his fists onto my mahogany desk, completely shattering the fragile illusion of his calm, patriarchal authority. He was not going to pay me a single dime. In his twisted, outdated worldview, I was an ungrateful, rebellious daughter who had illegally stolen his rightful property. By Tuesday morning, Harrison had completely bypassed our regular corporate counsel. He correctly assumed that the standard lawyers were far too incompetent for a war of this magnitude. Instead, he hired a massive, notoriously aggressive litigation firm located in the financial district. They were legal bulldogs, men in custom suits who specialized in burying vulnerable opponents in endless, suffocating paperwork. Harrison authorized them to draft a massive, scorched-earth lawsuit against me. He intended to sue me for intellectual property theft, malicious corporate sabotage, and a blatant breach of fiduciary duty. He also intended to enforce an incredibly strict non-compete clause. He genuinely believed he could intimidate me into submission with the sheer weight of a massive legal threat the moment a lawyer threatened my bank accounts. While my father was eagerly bleeding the company's last remaining cash reserves to pay exorbitant legal retainers, Naomi was fighting her own completely delusional war on the internet. As the logistics empire rapidly crumbled and hundreds of desperate truck drivers remained stranded across the nation, my ambitious sister-in-law took to her social media accounts to play the ultimate victim. She could not comprehend the terrifying financial disaster happening around her. Or perhaps she simply chose to ignore the ringing phones and screaming clients. Instead, she posted a series of highly curated passive-aggressive photos and videos to control her digital narrative. She posted a picture of herself sipping a massive iced matcha latte on her sprawling outdoor patio, looking deeply sorrowful, while wrapped in a designer cashmere blanket. The caption below the photo was a lengthy, dramatically written paragraph about the sheer toxicity of family betrayal and the ugly, destructive nature of corporate greed. She wrote eloquently about how heartbreaking it was when people you love choose cold money over warm family blood. She spun a ridiculous, highly produced narrative to her thousands of followers, framing Cameron and herself as the innocent, hardworking victims of an insanely jealous, bitter sister. Naomi fully believed that her wealthy father-in-law was going to completely crush me in civil court. She actually spent hours replying to comments from her followers, leaving heart emojis and vaguely hinting that a massive legal reckoning was coming. She assured her audience that justice would quickly be served and the rightful leaders of the company would emerge victorious. She was happily polishing the brass on the sinking ship, completely oblivious to the freezing water rapidly rising around her designer heels. The grand legal reckoning arrived at my luxury apartment building precisely at noon on Wednesday. I was sitting quietly at my kitchen island, reviewing the massive influx of direct emails from desperate logistics clients who were rapidly realizing Harrison Logistics was a dead end. The building concierge rang my private line to announce that a process server had arrived in the lobby. I instructed security to send him right up to my floor. When I opened my heavy wooden door, the young man handed me a massive stack of thick legal documents, his face incredibly serious as he formally confirmed my identity. I thanked him politely, closed the door, and carried the heavy stack to my dining table. It was an absolute masterpiece of legal intimidation. The lawsuit aggressively demanded an immediate court injunction to force me to hand over the master administrative passwords. It falsely claimed my technology firm Apex Solutions was a fraudulent shell company created using stolen corporate resources and company time. Furthermore, it heavily cited my executive non-compete clause, demanding I be barred from operating in the logistics industry for the next 5 years. I poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water and slowly read through the aggressive, heavily worded accusations. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. My heart rate did not elevate. My hands did not shake. I was completely, entirely unbothered. I picked up my phone and called Gideon, entirely trusting the flawless legal architecture he had meticulously constructed over the past 3 years. Gideon answered with a low, highly amused chuckle, having already received a digital copy of the lawsuit from the opposing firm. We spent exactly 20 minutes dissecting their aggressive claims. Gideon explained exactly why their massive lawsuit was fundamentally worthless and legally embarrassing. First, the non-compete clause they were desperately waving around was automatically rendered completely void the exact second Harrison forcefully terminated me without cause. By firing me, he broke the employment contract first, legally releasing me from any industry restrictions. Second, Apex Solutions was incorporated a full year before I even developed the supply chain software, funded entirely by a separate, private inheritance from my late grandmother. I had the bank records to prove that not a single penny of Harrison corporate money was ever utilized to build the system. They had absolutely no legal claim, no operational leverage, and absolutely no viable case. Gideon informed me that he was already drafting our response. We were not just going to file a motion to dismiss their ridiculous claims, we were going to countersue them for immediate breach of contract regarding the software lease, demanding the outstanding balance of the month plus severe financial penalties for unauthorized access attempts. My father wanted to play a high-stakes game of legal intimidation, relying on his aggressive lawyers to bully a woman he still viewed as a disobedient child. He failed to realize that he was walking into a courtroom completely unarmed, facing a general who had been studying his every weakness for 5 grueling years. They were just aggressively screaming into a dark void, completely unaware that their loud, expensive threats were only accelerating their own inevitable, highly public destruction. Exactly 7 days after the process server knocked on my apartment door, we found ourselves sitting in a sterile, heavily air-conditioned mediation room on the 45th floor of a neutral downtown high-rise. The environment was intentionally designed to be intimidating, featuring cold glass walls, gray minimalist furniture, and absolutely zero natural warmth. My father, Harrison, sat rigidly on the opposite side of the massive conference table. He had brought Cameron along, likely as an exercise in executive training. Flanking them were the three highly aggressive corporate litigators Harrison had hired. They were dressed in immaculate pinstripe suits, practically vibrating with aggressive energy, and they had covered their side of the table with massive, intimidating stacks of legal briefs and printed financial ledgers. They wanted to project overwhelming force. On our side of the table, the contrast was almost comical. I wore a sharp, tailored black suit, with my hair pulled back into a severe bun, exuding absolute calm. Gideon sat next to me. He did not bring a massive team of junior associates. He did not have towering stacks of intimidating paperwork. He had a single, incredibly thin leather briefcase resting flat on the table in front of him. He looked like a man who was entirely bored by the impending conversation. The lead litigator for my father, a man with a booming voice and a deeply arrogant demeanor, decided to open the mediation by coming in as hot as possible. He did not bother with professional pleasantries. He immediately launched into a highly aggressive, deeply theatrical monologue. He pointed a manicured finger across the table, loudly accusing me of malicious corporate espionage and deliberate intellectual property theft. He stated that taking the proprietary supply chain software offline was an act of digital terrorism against Harrison Logistics. He threatened to escalate the civil lawsuit into a full criminal investigation, promising to contact the federal authorities and have me thrown in jail for cyber sabotage if I did not immediately hand over the master administrative passwords and surrender all rights to Apex Solutions. While the lawyer shouted his aggressive threats, Harrison sat back in his chair with a deeply satisfied, smug expression. Cameron mirrored his father, crossing his arms and looking at me as if I were a common criminal finally facing justice. They genuinely believed this highly paid legal theater was working. They expected me to break down, apologize, and hand over the keys to the kingdom to avoid going to prison. I did not even blink. I just looked at Gideon. Gideon let the opposing lawyer completely finish his exhausting, high-volume tirade. He waited for the echoes of the threats to completely fade from the sterile room. Then, he slowly clicked his heavy gold pen, opened his slim leather briefcase, and pulled out a single piece of standard white printer paper. It was slightly yellowed at the edges, clearly a document that had been carefully filed away for a very long time. "Are you quite finished with your performance?" Gideon asked, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the tension like a straight razor. "Because your client has conveniently forgotten to provide you with the full historical context of this software system." Gideon slid the single piece of paper across the polished glass table. It glided smoothly and stopped directly in front of the lead litigator. The lawyer frowned, picking up the document with obvious suspicion. "That is a standard intellectual property waiver," Gideon explained, calmly leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "It was drafted and signed exactly 5 years ago during the second quarter of Sloan's first year as Chief Executive Officer. When my client initially proposed building a custom digital logistics infrastructure to save the company, she brought the idea directly to Harrison. She requested a small budget to hire developers. I watched my father's smug expression instantly evaporate, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization as his memory finally caught up with reality. Harrison mocked the idea. Gideon continued staring directly at my father. He called the software a ridiculous nerd toy. He explicitly and aggressively refused to allocate a single dime of company money to fund the project. But he went a step further to protect himself. He was so terrified that Sloan's project would accrue debt that he demanded she sign a waiver releasing Harrison Logistics from any financial liability. In doing so, Harrison happily signed away all corporate rights titles and future interests to any software Sloan developed independently. The signature in blue ink at the bottom of that page belongs to your client. He gave her complete legal ownership so she could build it on her own dime, on her own time. The lead litigator stared at the signature, his face draining of all color. He realized instantly that the entire foundation of his massive lawsuit had just violently collapsed. But Gideon was not finished dismantling them. Furthermore, Gideon stated, his tone shifting from bored to completely lethal. Your attempt to enforce a non-compete clause is legally embarrassing. As you can see in the termination agreement your client proudly handed my client last Tuesday, Sloan was fired entirely without cause. Under state employment law, terminating an executive without cause instantly nullifies any non-compete restrictions. She is a free agent. She owns the software outright. You have absolutely no case, no leverage, and no jurisdiction here. The silence in the mediation room was absolute and suffocating. The three aggressive lawyers read the document, passing it between themselves. They did not argue. They did not shout. They did not try to find a legal loophole because there was none. They had been hired to fight a war based on a massive, arrogant lie told by a man who fundamentally misunderstood his own business. The lead litigator placed the waiver back on the table. His aggressive posture was completely gone, replaced by the exhausted frustration of a professional who realized he was backing a massive loser. Without saying a word to us, he turned to Harrison. The litigator leaned in close, completely ignoring the massive stack of useless briefs he had brought, and whispered directly into my father's ear. "You lied to us." The lawyer hissed, his voice low, but completely audible in the quiet room. "You have absolutely no legal claim to that system. You are completely exposed. We are dropping this lawsuit immediately before Gideon countersues us for malicious prosecution and gets us all sanctioned." The lawyers did not wait for Harrison to argue. They immediately began packing their expensive briefcases, rapidly shoving their useless paperwork away. As the lead litigator snapped his briefcase shut, he looked down at Harrison with pure, unfiltered disgust. "My professional advice to you is to settle this immediately," he told my father. "Pay whatever she is asking for the software lease, or prepare to file for corporate bankruptcy by Friday." The aggressive legal team walked out of the room, leaving Harrison and Cameron completely abandoned at the massive conference table. They sat there in stunned, humiliated silence. The grand counterattack had completely failed. The expensive legal shield had shattered into a million pieces. They finally understood that there was no magical loophole, no aggressive bullying tactic, and no patriarchal authority that could save them from the airtight trap I had built. The heavy glass door of the mediation room clicked shut, leaving Harrison and Cameron entirely alone in the sterile silence. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The expensive legal shield they thought would protect them had evaporated into thin air, leaving them completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of the free market. But the utter humiliation in that downtown conference room was merely a quiet prelude to the absolute financial slaughter that was already unfolding across the country. In the highly connected, fast-paced world of national logistics, corporate secrets do not exist. Blood in the water attracts sharks immediately. By Thursday morning, the entire industry knew that Harrison Logistics was effectively a dead corporation walking. The whispers had started as soon as the screens went black on Monday, but the absolute failure of Cameron to manually route the national fleet confirmed every terrible suspicion. Major corporate clients do not care about family drama. They do not care about patriarchal succession legacy or who sits in the fancy executive chair. They only care about one thing: reliable, flawless execution. And Harrison Logistics was failing spectacularly. Millions of dollars worth of perishable goods were actively spoiling in idle trailers. Massive shipments of imported electronics were completely missing their strict retail delivery windows. The chaotic, frantic manual dispatching attempts by Cameron were resulting in drivers being sent to the completely wrong distribution centers, burning expensive diesel fuel for absolutely zero profit. It was Arthur Sterling who fired the first lethal shot. He was the very same industry titan who had proudly toasted to my father's legacy at the extravagant celebratory dinner less than a week prior. Sterling did not bother calling Harrison to demand an explanation or negotiate a timeline. He simply directed his corporate attorneys to fax a formal notice of immediate contract termination directly to our executive suite. The legal document cited a standard, indisputable clause present in every single logistics service agreement: failure to deliver services. Because my proprietary software was offline, Harrison Logistics had officially breached their guaranteed delivery windows. Sterling was legally pulling his massive, highly lucrative account, and he was taking his millions of dollars in annual revenue with him. Sterling opening the floodgates triggered a massive, unstoppable avalanche. Once the largest client officially jumped ship, the rest of the portfolio instantly panicked. Throughout Thursday afternoon, the fax machine in the Harrison Logistics executive suite began printing a relentless, devastating stream of contract terminations. The same multi-line phones that had been ringing with desperate truck drivers were now ringing with furious client representatives, officially cutting their financial ties. Cameron sat completely paralyzed at my old mahogany desk, watching the physical manifestation of his inherited empire literally shred itself into pieces right in front of his eyes. They were losing millions of dollars of guaranteed contracted revenue by the hour, and they were completely powerless to stop the bleeding. But those massive corporate clients still needed their heavy freight moved immediately. They still needed an advanced digital infrastructure to track their expensive inventory. They did not have the time or the resources to vet entirely new vendors and integrate new operating systems. I knew this exactly. I had strategically counted on their absolute desperation. While Cameron was drowning in termination papers, I was sitting in a sprawling, sunlit, temporary office space I had quietly leased 3 blocks away. I was not alone. The brilliant executive team that had loyally walked out of Harrison Logistics on Monday morning was sitting around the long conference table, their laptops open, and my Apex Solutions software running flawlessly on their bright screens. We were not just a software licensing firm anymore. I had rapidly pivoted our entire operational model. We were now a fully functional, hyper-efficient logistics management agency. The exact moment Arthur Sterling terminated his contract with my father, my former vice president of sales called him directly. We did not need to pitch our services or prove our competency. Sterling already knew my executives, he completely trusted my software, and he desperately needed his supply chain stabilized. Within 20 minutes, Sterling signed a massive direct service agreement with Apex Solutions LLC. The transition was completely seamless. We simply reactivated his specific tracking modules on our private servers. Since Harrison's physical trucks were still stranded without fuel codes, we immediately began routing Sterling's freight using our own rapidly assembled network of independent owner-operators and third-party trucking fleets. The cargo started moving again flawlessly under my direct command. What happened next was the single greatest wealth transfer in the history of the regional market. As soon as the other panicking clients realized that the true operational brain of Harrison Logistics had simply relocated down the street, they immediately followed Sterling's lead. My dedicated sales team worked continuously through the night, processing digital contracts and migrating entire corporate accounts over to Apex Solutions. We were aggressively absorbing the very lifeblood of my family's legacy. In a matter of mere days, we successfully captured 90% of my father's entire revenue stream. I did not steal his clients. I simply offered them a highly functional, fully digital lifeboat, while he forced them to drown on his rapidly sinking ship. The financial reality of this massive market shift hit Harrison Logistics with devastating, lethal force. A traditional corporate logistics firm operates on incredibly tight margins, requiring massive amounts of liquid cash to float the daily costs of fuel, commercial insurance, and heavy fleet maintenance until the client invoices are finally paid. Without that constant, massive stream of incoming client revenue, my father's company instantly began bleeding out. The last remaining cash reserves were rapidly swallowed by the exorbitant legal fees he had wasted on his failed lawsuit and the massive emergency expenses incurred by his stranded, completely disorganized fleet. By Friday evening, the company was officially operating deep in the red. Harrison was plummeting rapidly and uncontrollably right back toward the exact $5 million mountain of debt he had been suffocating under when I first took over. I had spent 5 grueling years building his massive empire from the ground up, and it had taken me exactly 5 days to completely strip it down to the studs. The financial devastation of Harrison Logistics did not remain confined to the sterile walls of their executive suite. The terrifying reality of their plummeting bank accounts followed my father and brother home, crashing violently into the lavish, heavily mortgaged family estate. The immediate catalyst for the next phase of their war was not another corporate lawsuit or a lost logistics client. It was a declined platinum credit card. On Saturday morning, Naomi attempted to purchase a $5,000 designer handbag to soothe her mounting anxiety regarding the tense atmosphere in the house, only to have the transaction brutally rejected. The bank had frozen the personal family accounts to secure the massive, rapidly defaulting corporate credit lines. The impenetrable bubble of Naomi's luxurious lifestyle had finally popped, and she reacted with the vicious, unhinged desperation of a cornered animal whose survival was suddenly threatened. Naomi abandoned her vague, passive-aggressive quotes and launched a highly targeted, incredibly vicious smear campaign across all of her digital platforms. She transformed her massive social media presence into a digital weapon entirely aimed at destroying my personal reputation. She posted a highly produced 20-minute video where she sat on her plush velvet sofa wearing no makeup to appear exhausted and traumatized. She stared directly into the camera and cried real heavy tears, accusing me of orchestrating a massive illegal financial coup. She did not mention her husband's profound executive incompetence or my father's arrogant termination agreement. Instead, she painted me as a sociopathic, money-hungry spinster who had coldly swindled her own elderly parents out of their life savings. She used incredibly toxic, emotionally charged language, explicitly stating that I lacked a husband and children of my own, and therefore wanted to violently destroy the beautiful family Cameron had built out of pure, bitter spite. She begged her followers to share the video, claiming that my unprecedented greed was going to put her innocent children out on the street. The video was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation, perfectly designed to weaponize public sympathy and bury the actual corporate facts under a mountain of fake tears. While Naomi commanded the digital front line, my mother, Patricia, officially entered the battlefield. Patricia had spent her entire life completely ignoring the actual operations of the family business. She viewed the logistics company merely as a magical machine that effortlessly printed the money required to fund her exclusive country club memberships and lavish European vacations. But Patricia was an absolute master of social warfare. She understood family politics better than anyone, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the narrative to protect her golden child, Cameron. As soon as Harrison informed her that the company was bleeding cash and the estate might be targeted by ruthless creditors, Patricia completely mobilized. She sat in her expansive, sunlit conservatory with a massive glass of white wine and a heavily worn address book. She systematically called every single aunt, uncle, cousin, and family friend in our extensive social circle. Patricia did not explain the software licensing dispute or the legally severed non-compete clause. She spun a deeply toxic, entirely fabricated narrative that tapped perfectly into the worst patriarchal stereotypes harbored by our extended family. She told them that I had suffered a complete psychological breakdown. She swore that I had completely lost my mind, driven mad by a deep, raging jealousy over Cameron's perfect marriage and his beautiful wife. According to Patricia, I could not handle being a lonely, aging woman, while my younger brother effortlessly stepped into his rightful role as the head of the family legacy. She wailed into the receiver, telling our relatives that my intense, psychotic jealousy had pushed me to commit corporate treason. She claimed I was actively trying to force my own elderly parents into absolute homelessness just to punish Cameron for being happy. She weaponized their traditional values against me, completely erasing my 5 years of grueling corporate leadership and replacing it with the image of an unstable, hysterical woman throwing a catastrophic tantrum. The combined force of Naomi's viral smear campaign and Patricia's ruthless phone tree hit my personal cell phone like a massive, unstoppable avalanche. By Sunday afternoon, my device was practically vibrating off my kitchen island, completely flooded with hundreds of hateful messages, screaming voicemails, and aggressive social media tags. Aunts who had not bothered to call me on my birthday for over a decade were suddenly leaving frantic voicemails, calling me an absolute monster and a permanent disgrace to the family name. My cousins flooded my private inbox with aggressive paragraphs, calling me a traitor and demanding I immediately return the money I had allegedly stolen from my vulnerable parents. Distant family friends left nasty comments on my professional networking profiles, warning others that I was a deceitful, sociopathic swindler who could never be trusted in the business world. They wanted to isolate me completely. They wanted to make the social pressure so incredibly suffocating and painful that I would break down, apologize, and surrender the billion-dollar software just to stop the relentless emotional abuse. It was the exact same toxic tactic my family had used for my entire life to keep me obedient and compliant. They genuinely believed that if they threatened my place within the family unit and destroyed my reputation, I would instantly fold. I sat alone in my quiet, peaceful apartment, scrolling through the endless stream of pure, unfiltered vitriol. I read every single hateful text message. I listened to every single screaming voicemail from my mother and my aunts. I watched Naomi's ridiculous crying video from start to finish. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel an ounce of guilt or a shred of the profound isolation they were desperately trying to inflict upon me. Instead, a cold, absolute clarity washed over me. Their vicious social media war and their frantic, hateful phone calls were not signs of their power. They were the ultimate confirmation of their total, irreversible defeat. They had lost the legal battle in that sterile mediation room. They had lost the corporate war. They had lost their massive clients and their entire revenue stream. The only weapon they had left was cheap, pathetic emotional manipulation. I calmly opened my phone settings and systematically blocked every single family member's phone number without a second thought. I deactivated my personal social media profiles, completely cutting off their ability to reach me or monitor my life. I poured the negativity down the drain and turned my focus back to my laptop, where the Apex Solutions revenue dashboard was proudly displaying a massive, unprecedented surge in our quarterly profits. They could keep their toxic family gossip and their fake internet tears. I was far too busy running an empire to care. My phone remained disconnected from their toxic reality, laying completely silent on my kitchen counter. I knew exactly how my family operated, having spent 30 years studying their manipulative tactics. Narcissists require constant oxygen to keep their fabricated fires burning bright. They desperately need a reaction to validate their existence. If I had released a professional statement, or worse, engaged in a public shouting match in the comment sections of Naomi's videos, I would have handed them the exact ammunition they wanted. I would have given them a tangible villain to fight on their perfectly curated digital stage. But you cannot fight a ghost. By offering absolutely zero resistance and completely removing myself from the narrative, I starved them of their favorite commodity. I denied them their narcissistic supply. Without a target to attack, Naomi's viral narrative slowly began to eat itself. She was desperately setting up her expensive ring light in her massive, heavily mortgaged walk-in closet, churning out multiple videos a day to an audience that was rapidly losing interest. Her followers started noticing the massive, glaring inconsistencies in her tearful accusations. People began asking logical questions in the comments. If I was just a broke, jealous spinster, how did I manage to legally steal $1 billion software system? If the entire logistics company was fraudulently taken, why were there absolutely no police reports or pending federal investigations? The complete silence on my end forced the public to look much closer at the massive cracks in her fabricated story, and the sympathy she so desperately craved quickly turned into digital suspicion. My mother experienced a similar frantic failure with her aggressive phone tree. The aunts and uncles who were initially so eager to grab their pitchforks suddenly grew incredibly bored when the target completely disappeared from the social circles. Without any fresh gossip to trade, or any defensive statements from me to brutally dissect the extended family, lost interest. I was systematically dismantling the emotional leverage they had spent an entire lifetime building. For the first time in my life, the collective toxic weight of the Harrison family expectations completely vanished from my shoulders. The silence in my apartment was profound, peaceful, and absolutely victorious. I did not have the luxury of wasting hours refreshing social media feeds to watch their social downfall, because I was aggressively expanding a logistics empire. While Naomi was busy crying for internet sympathy and Patricia was frantically dialing distant cousins, I was sitting in my corner office, authorizing massive corporate wire transfers. The real war was not happening on a smartphone screen. It was happening deep within the highly secure, encrypted servers of the largest commercial bank in Chicago. Harrison Logistics was not a stable company. It was an incredibly fragile empire built entirely on a terrifying mountain of heavily leveraged commercial debt. When I took over 5 years ago, I had structured massive corporate loans to keep the massive national fleet running, while I quietly built the software system that would eventually save us. Those commercial loans came with incredibly strict, uncompromising financial covenants, requiring massive monthly balloon payments. My father had casually assumed the revenue would always flow, unconditionally, completely forgetting that he had just aggressively evicted the digital system that generated every single dollar. By the second week of the month, the massive balloon payment on the primary corporate credit line became officially past due. Commercial banks do not care about family legacy patriarchal succession or who sits in the fancy mahogany executive chair. They only care about risk mitigation. When the massive monthly payment failed to clear the automated system, the bank immediately flagged Harrison Logistics as a critical financial risk. The institutional analysts looked at the massive, highly publicized exodus of our largest corporate clients, the completely paralyzed national trucking fleet, and the rapidly plummeting revenue metrics, and they absolutely panicked. The bank officially designated the entire portfolio of Harrison corporate loans as distressed, highly toxic debt. They wanted it completely off their financial books immediately, terrified that the company was going to file for total bankruptcy by the end of the month, which would leave the bank holding millions of dollars of completely worthless commercial trucks and empty warehouses. This was the exact lethal moment I had been meticulously planning for. I did not approach the commercial bank directly as Sloan Harrison, nor did I use the newly minted Apex Solutions LLC. That would have instantly alerted my father to the incoming strike, giving him a small window to attempt a desperate countermeasure. Instead, I directed Gideon to rapidly establish a completely anonymous, airtight proxy firm named Obsidian Holdings LLC, registered quietly in Delaware. I aggressively funneled a massive portion of the newly acquired entirely liquid capital from Apex Solutions directly into the Obsidian accounts. I had successfully absorbed 90% of my father's revenue stream in a matter of days, leaving my business accounts completely overflowing with the exact cash he desperately needed to survive. Through Gideon and the anonymous shield of Obsidian Holdings, I made a quiet, highly aggressive, and strictly confidential offer to the commercial bank. We offered to purchase the entirety of the distressed Harrison Logistics debt in a single massive wire transfer for pennies on the dollar. The banking executives were absolutely thrilled to dump the toxic asset and recoup a large portion of their capital without having to engage in a lengthy, highly expensive corporate bankruptcy proceeding. The legal paperwork was incredibly complex, requiring dozens of secure digital signatures and massive financial disclosures, but we pushed the transaction through the system with ruthless efficiency. While my father was sitting in his dark, silent office, desperately trying to convince his remaining terrified employees that a financial miracle was coming, the massive wire transfer successfully cleared the Federal Reserve Network. The bank completely wiped the debt from their ledgers. They legally transferred every single promissory note, the heavy mortgages on all the regional distribution centers, and the specific liens on all 500 commercial trucks directly to Obsidian Holdings. Naomi was still crying on the internet about a stolen family legacy, completely unaware that her family literally owned absolutely nothing. They were living in a massive estate financed by corporate wealth that no longer existed. Cameron was pretending to be a powerful executive while sitting in a building that I could legally foreclose on by the end of the business day. In one single devastating financial maneuver, I had quietly transformed from my father's estranged, forcefully terminated daughter into his absolute, undeniable master. I was no longer just the legal owner of his software. I was the sole owner of every single dollar of debt attached to his name, and I held the absolute power to destroy his entire world with a single signature. I held the absolute power to destroy his entire world with a single signature. And on Monday morning, I pressed the heavy gold pen to the paper and signed the final execution order. Gideon arrived at my new corporate headquarters, holding the final notarized transfer deeds directly from the commercial bank. By executing the massive debt purchase through Obsidian Holdings, I had officially become the primary, uncontested lien holder of Harrison Logistics. But my father had made a catastrophic, arrogant error many years ago, when the company was first struggling to survive. Because the corporate ledger was far too weak to secure the massive initial bank loans, Harrison had aggressively cross-collateralized the debt. He had personally guaranteed the massive corporate lines of credit, using every single private asset attached to his name. The massive, sprawling family estate in the wealthy suburbs, the expensive fleet of luxury vehicles, his personal investment portfolios. He had put his entire life on the table, blindly assuming his patriarchal authority somehow made him immune to basic financial gravity. Now I owned the legal paper to his entire existence. If he missed a single payment, which I knew he absolutely would because I had already drained his revenue, I could legally foreclose on his failing business and his pristine home simultaneously. I did not wait for the end of the month to begin tightening the heavy financial noose around their necks. As the newly established legal creditor Obsidian Holdings had the absolute right to audit the remaining financial accounts and immediately halt any spending deemed non-essential to the survival of the business. I instructed Gideon to issue a hard freeze on all executive corporate credit cards and freeze the personal accounts directly tied to the collateral. The commercial bank, incredibly happy to comply with their new, massive debt owner, executed the aggressive freeze within minutes. The financial oxygen feeding the Harrison family estate was instantly and completely cut off. Cameron discovered the terrifying new reality precisely at noon. He was sitting in an upscale, heavily crowded steakhouse in the financial district, desperately trying to woo a minor regional client who had not yet fled to Apex Solutions. Cameron was sweating through his expensive custom suit, aggressively ordering vintage bottles of wine and promising impossible delivery metrics to a man who looked completely unconvinced. When the waiter finally brought the leather check holder for the massive bill, Cameron smoothly dropped his heavy metal corporate card onto the silver tray, desperately trying to project the image of a wealthy, unbothered executive. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned, his face a perfect mask of awkward professional pity. He discreetly informed Cameron that the card had been brutally declined. Assuming it was a simple bank error, Cameron haughtily handed over his personal black card. That card was declined as well. The regional client watched in absolute disgust as the supposedly powerful chief executive officer of a national logistics firm had to quietly beg the restaurant manager to let him wire the funds later, ultimately forcing the client to pay for his own lunch. Cameron left the restaurant utterly humiliated, the fragile illusion of his corporate power completely shattered in front of the exact people he desperately needed to impress. While Cameron was dying a slow public death in the financial district, Naomi was setting herself up for a spectacular public execution in the high-end retail district. Completely oblivious to the freezing of the bank accounts, she had strutted into an exclusive, appointment-only designer boutique. She was heavily accessorized and filming a new video for her followers on her phone, proudly continuing her completely fabricated narrative as a brave, glamorous victim. She spent 2 hours having the attentive sales associates pull out thousands of dollars worth of new season apparel, treating the boutique staff like her personal servants. She piled designer bags, silk scarves, and expensive shoes onto the glass counter, intentionally aiming her camera at the impressive mountain of luxury goods to prove to her followers that her lifestyle was completely untouched by my alleged betrayal. Naomi handed her heavy platinum card to the store manager with a practiced, incredibly haughty smile. The manager swiped the card through the terminal. The machine instantly emitted a sharp, angry beep. The screen flashed a bright red warning. Account frozen. Do not honor. The manager frowned, apologizing profusely, and tried the transaction again. The exact same red warning aggressively appeared. Naomi stopped filming her perfectly manicured hands suddenly, shaking with panic. She aggressively insisted that the machine was broken, raising her voice and demanding they manually enter the number. She then pulled out 3 different backup credit cards, all tied directly to Harrison's personal bank accounts, and slammed them onto the glass counter. One by one, the manager swiped the cards. One by one, they all aggressively declined. The other wealthy patrons in the quiet, exclusive boutique stopped their shopping and stared openly at the escalating scene. Naomi, the woman who had just spent the entire weekend crying on the internet about her stolen family legacy, was now publicly screaming at a retail worker because she could not afford a single pair of shoes. The store manager finally lost his patience, politely but firmly pushing the pile of declined plastic cards back across the counter and asking Naomi to leave the unpaid merchandise. Naomi snatched her useless cards, her face burning with profound embarrassment and absolute unadulterated terror. She practically ran out of the boutique, desperately fleeing the disgusted stares of the other wealthy customers. The heavy glass doors shut behind her, permanently cutting off the luxurious, air-conditioned dream world she had comfortably lived in for years. She stood on the hot, unforgiving concrete of the city sidewalk, staring at the declined plastic in her trembling hands. The vicious, targeted smear campaign she had launched against me suddenly felt completely irrelevant. The horrifying reality of their total, unavoidable financial ruin was no longer a theoretical threat hidden deep in a complex legal document. It had just violently crashed down on top of her, instantly crushing her fake digital empire into absolute dust. Naomi did not call an expensive black car service to take her home because the application on her phone instantly locked her out. She was forced to hail a standard city taxi, aggressively arguing with the driver over the fare before finally thrusting a crumpled $50 bill at him from her emergency cash reserve. She slammed the heavy oak door of her sprawling suburban house, tossing her empty hands into the air. The massive, pristine foyer was completely silent, a stark contrast to the absolute raging hurricane inside her mind. She stormed into the main living room and found Cameron sitting on the edge of the velvet sofa, his expensive tie loosened, holding a heavy glass of cheap whiskey he had poured from the backup liquor cabinet. The moment Naomi saw his defeated posture, the carefully constructed facade of the perfect supportive corporate wife completely and violently shattered. She did not offer him a warm embrace or words of encouragement. She aggressively threw her designer sunglasses across the room, watching them shatter against the custom marble fireplace. She unleashed a vicious, screaming tirade that echoed through the empty, massive house. She demanded to know why every single piece of plastic in her wallet was completely useless. She screamed about the profound public humiliation she had just endured at the boutique, painting herself as the ultimate victim of his catastrophic stupidity. Cameron tried to stand up and defend his fragile ego, raising his voice to blame me, to blame the bank, to blame the chaotic global economy. But Naomi ruthlessly cut him down. She stripped away his unearned arrogance and brutally exposed his complete lack of executive talent. She yelled that he had been handed a fully functional, highly profitable empire on a silver platter, and he had managed to completely burn it to the ground in less than 2 weeks. She told him he was a pathetic imitation of a businessman, an incompetent little boy playing dress-up in his father's suits. The marriage had always been a transactional arrangement, built entirely on the promise of unlimited corporate wealth and high social status. With the money completely evaporated, there was absolutely nothing left but raw, unfiltered resentment. Cameron stared at his screaming wife, finally realizing that the loyalty he thought he commanded was directly tied to a bank account he no longer controlled. While Cameron's marriage was aggressively disintegrating in the suburbs, Harrison was facing his own terrifying apocalypse inside the heavy wood-paneled walls of the family mansion. He sat alone in his massive study, surrounded by generations of family history, staring blindly at the printed financial ledgers spread across his antique desk. The numbers were not just bad, they were completely, unsalvageably lethal. The realization finally pierced through his thick layer of patriarchal delusion. The bank had not just frozen the corporate accounts, they had frozen his entire life. The massive estate he was currently sitting in, the luxury cars parked in the heated garage, and the private investment portfolios he had meticulously built over 40 years were all completely locked down by the new aggressive lien holder. Harrison picked up the heavy landline receiver and frantically dialed the lead partner of his aggressive corporate litigation firm. He did not sound like a powerful, commanding chief executive officer. He sounded like a terrified, desperate old man begging for a miracle. He pleaded with the lawyer to file an emergency injunction, to find a legal loophole to release his personal assets from the corporate cross-collateralization. He begged them to buy him just 1 more month to find a new investor. The lawyer's response was incredibly brief and absolutely chilling. The law firm was officially dropping Harrison Logistics as a client due to heavily outstanding unpaid legal invoices. The lawyer coldly informed my father that his personal bankruptcy was an absolute mathematical certainty within the next 3 weeks, and strongly advised him to start packing his belongings before the bank initiated a formal, aggressive foreclosure on the family mansion. The lawyer hung up the phone, leaving Harrison completely isolated in the deafening silence of his dying empire. My father buried his face in his trembling hands, the terrifying reality of his impending homelessness crushing the last remaining breath of his legendary arrogance. He was going to lose everything. He was going to be violently evicted from his own legacy. But right at the exact moment of his absolute darkest despair, a sharp, sudden knock at the front door echoed through the empty mansion. A private courier had arrived holding a sleek, heavy black folder requiring an immediate, direct signature. Harrison practically ripped the document out of the courier's hands, desperate for any distraction from the terrifying ledgers on his desk. He carried the folder back into his study and carefully broke the heavy wax seal. Inside was a single, pristine proposal printed on expensive, thick parchment. It was a formal corporate buyout offer from a mysterious restructuring firm named Vanguard Holdings. Harrison read the document 3 times, his heart pounding aggressively against his ribs. He had never heard of Vanguard Holdings, and a quick search on his phone revealed only a sparse, highly secretive corporate landing page indicating they specialized in aggressive acquisitions of distressed assets. The offer laid out in the document was incredibly precise and ruthlessly calculated. Vanguard Holdings was offering to completely purchase Harrison Logistics, absorbing all of the toxic debt and acquiring all of the physical corporate assets, including the massive distribution centers and the paralyzed trucking fleet. The purchase price they offered was not generous. It was the exact numerical definition of a financial insult. It was just enough money to completely clear the massive corporate debt release, the aggressive liens on the personal assets, and save the family mansion from immediate foreclosure. There would be absolutely no leftover profit. There would be no golden parachute. Harrison would walk away from his 40-year legacy with precisely $0 in his bank account. But the proposal offered the one single thing my father valued above all else. It offered the immediate preservation of his physical home and his outward social status. It completely eliminated the terrifying threat of personal bankruptcy and the profound public humiliation of being forcefully dragged out of his mansion by county sheriffs. Vanguard Holdings was throwing him a tiny, heavily spiked lifeline while he was actively drowning in the middle of a freezing ocean. Harrison did not call a financial advisor. He did not attempt to negotiate a higher purchase price or investigate the true identity of the mysterious holding company. Driven entirely by blind panic and a desperate need to save his precious house, Harrison grabbed his heavy gold pen and frantically signed his name on the dotted line, eagerly swallowing the lethal bait exactly as I knew he would. Harrison lifted the heavy gold pen from the parchment, a massive exhale of relief shuddering through his chest as the ink dried on the Vanguard Holdings agreement. He had done it. He had stared directly into the terrifying abyss of total financial ruin and miraculously pulled the family legacy back from the absolute brink. He immediately summoned Cameron, Naomi, and Patricia into the expansive living room to deliver the glorious news. However, in true narcissistic fashion, Harrison completely omitted the horrifying mathematical reality of the buyout. He did not tell them that the purchase price would instantly evaporate the moment it hit the bank to clear the massive corporate debts. He did not mention that he was walking away with 0 actual profit. Instead, he spun a magnificent triumphant tale. He proudly announced that he had successfully orchestrated a brilliant corporate merger with an elite, highly secretive holding company. He declared that Vanguard Holdings had recognized the immense, undeniable value of the Harrison brand and offered a highly lucrative acquisition deal. He told them the family estate was completely safe and their high social status was permanently secured. The collective amnesia that washed over the family was instantaneous and utterly spectacular. All the vicious screaming, the terrifying credit card declines, and the profound public humiliation of the previous week were immediately and completely forgotten. They eagerly consumed Harrison's fabricated narrative because it was exactly what they desperately needed to hear. They genuinely believed that Harrison had brilliantly outsmarted my temporary technological blockade. In their twisted minds, they were not the desperate victims of a hostile corporate takeover. They were the victorious conquerors who had bravely weathered a minor annoying storm caused by a jealous, bitter spinster. By Friday morning, the day of the official acquisition signing, the mood inside the sprawling family estate was positively electric with arrogant celebration. They treated the legal appointment not as the solemn death of a 40-year-old family business, but as a grand, royal coronation. They dressed meticulously for the occasion, draping themselves in the most expensive, ostentatious armor their closets could provide. They wanted to project an image of absolute, untouchable wealth and undeniable dominance to the mysterious executives of Vanguard Holdings. Patricia spent 3 grueling hours with her private hair and makeup team, who had been hastily summoned to the estate and paid from her secret stash of emergency cash. She wore a tailored, stark white Chanel suit that screamed of old money and untouchable privilege. She adorned her neck and wrists with heavy, glittering diamond tennis bracelets, wanting to ensure the incoming executives understood precisely who they were dealing with. Naomi, completely recovered from her humiliating meltdown at the designer boutique, squeezed herself into a skin-tight, violently red designer dress. She carried a massive, incredibly rare crocodile Birkin bag on her arm, like a weapon, her perfect blowout bouncing as she paraded around the marble foyer. She had already reactivated her social media accounts, posting a vague, highly filtered photo of her morning champagne glass, with a caption celebrating new beginnings and massive blessings. Cameron and Harrison emerged from their respective dressing rooms, looking like mirror images of arrogant delusion. They wore matching custom-tailored Italian silk suits, their expensive silk ties knotted perfectly at their throats. Cameron had practically bathed in expensive cologne, heavily slicking his hair back to look like a ruthless Wall Street titan. Harrison wore his favorite vintage Rolex, adjusting the heavy gold band with a deeply satisfied smirk. They looked at each other and nodded, fully believing they were about to walk into a boardroom and completely dominate the negotiation table. They climbed into the back of a rented luxury town car, since their personal drivers were still technically furloughed, and ordered the driver to take them to the financial district. The meeting was scheduled at one of the most exclusive, high-security corporate law firms in the city, located on the top floor of a massive glass skyscraper. When the elevator doors silently glided open, the family strode into the pristine, minimalist reception area as if they personally owned the entire building. Harrison aggressively approached the front desk, loudly announcing his arrival and demanding to be taken to the Vanguard Holdings representatives immediately. The receptionist, completely unfazed by his manufactured bluster, politely instructed them to wait in the private executive lounge while the final documents were being prepared. The executive waiting room was a masterclass in modern corporate luxury, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows offering a dizzying view of the city, plush leather armchairs, and a massive mahogany coffee table. The family took their seats, practically vibrating with smug, unearned confidence. The tension that had nearly destroyed them just days prior had morphed into a toxic shared euphoria. Patricia elegantly crossed her legs, carefully smoothing the pristine white fabric of her skirt. She looked out at the sprawling city skyline, a deeply satisfied, arrogant smile stretching across her face. "I told you all there was absolutely nothing to worry about," Patricia declared, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. She picked up a crystal glass of sparkling water from the table and took a delicate sip. "The Harrison family legacy always survives. We are simply cut from a different cloth. It takes far more than a bitter, hysterical woman throwing a childish temper tantrum to tear down what we have built." Sloane genuinely thought she could break us. She thought she could take away our home. but she completely underestimated the sheer power of your father's business connections. Cameron aggressively nodded in agreement, leaning back in his heavy leather chair and casually resting his ankle on his knee. Exactly, he sneered, pulling down his expensive cuffs. She tried to play a high-stakes game of corporate chicken, and she spectacularly crashed her own car. Vanguard Holdings is going to inject massive capital into the infrastructure. Once the merger is complete, I am going to personally restructure the entire logistics network. We do not even need her ridiculous software anymore. I will just hire a new team of developers to build something completely superior. Naomi was barely listening to her husband's delusional corporate fantasies. She was furiously typing on her heavy gold smartphone, her manicured thumbs flying across the bright screen. I am already looking at private villas on the Amalfi Coast, Naomi announced brightly, not bothering to look up from her phone. She excitedly tilted the screen toward Patricia, displaying a pristine photograph of a massive Italian mansion overlooking a sparkling blue ocean. Since we have been under so much ridiculous, unnecessary stress this month, I think we all deserve a massive European vacation. I was thinking we could charter a private yacht for 2 weeks in August. We can use the initial buyout money to secure the reservation today. It will be the perfect way to celebrate Cameron's new position with the holding company. Harrison sat quietly, letting the toxic, delusional chatter of his family wash over him. He knew they were planning vacations with money that did not actually exist, but he simply did not care. He had successfully maintained the illusion. He had protected his patriarchal image. He genuinely believed he was about to walk into the adjacent boardroom, shake hands with a group of faceless corporate executives, and walk away clean. They sat there in their expensive suits and sparkling diamonds, completely intoxicated by their own supreme arrogance, blissfully unaware that they were sitting directly in the center of a perfectly constructed slaughterhouse, eagerly waiting for the butcher to arrive. Exactly at 10 o'clock, a junior legal associate entered the waiting room, politely instructing the family that the Vanguard Holdings representatives were ready to receive them. Harrison puffed out his chest confidently, leading Patricia Cameron and Naomi down the long, glass-paneled hallway. They strutted into a sprawling, opulent boardroom featuring a massive, polished mahogany table. They took their seats on one side, proudly arranging their expensive bags and adjusting their silk ties. A few moments later, the heavy double doors at the far end of the room clicked open. Harrison quickly stood up, extending his hand and pasting on his most charming patriarchal smile, fully prepared to greet his corporate saviors. But the arrogant smile violently froze on his face. Walking through the doors was not a team of faceless Wall Street executives. It was Gideon, carrying his familiar, slim leather briefcase. And right behind him, wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal suit and a look of absolute icy detachment, was me. The color completely drained from my father's face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His extended hand dropped awkwardly to his side. Patricia gasped loudly, her hand flying to her diamond necklace in sheer panic. Naomi let out a choked sound of pure confusion, while Cameron stared at me as if I were a literal ghost. I walked calmly to the head of the massive table and took the dominant executive chair. Gideon stood quietly by my side. I looked at the four of them, watching their arrogant delusions completely shatter. "Good morning, Harrison," I said smoothly, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "I see you brought the entire family to witness your formal corporate surrender." Cameron found his voice first, stammering aggressively. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "This is a private acquisition meeting with Vanguard Holdings. Security needs to remove you immediately." I offered a cold, entirely humorless smile. "I am Vanguard Holdings Cameron," I stated clearly. "It is a newly formed, wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Solutions LLC. I am the mysterious ghost investor you were so desperately hoping would save you. I own your distressed debt. I hold the legal liens on your luxury vehicles, your private investment portfolios, and your precious suburban mansion." Gideon opened his briefcase and retrieved the massive buyout contract my father had frantically signed just 2 days prior. He slid it across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of Harrison. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the table, holding my father's terrified gaze. "I am not here to negotiate a partnership," I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal, uncompromising register. "I am here to buy your scrap metal. The terms you already agreed to remain exactly the same. You will immediately sign over your remaining 51% controlling stake in Harrison Logistics. You will hand me the legal keys to the entire empire, and you will walk away with exactly enough money to pay off the commercial bank. You get to keep your house, but you walk away with absolutely zero profit. You are entirely finished in this industry." Harrison began to physically shake, pure rage and profound humiliation battling for control of his body. "You cannot do this to your own blood," he whispered hoarsely. I tapped the heavy gold pen sitting next to the contract. "I already did," I replied instantly. "Sign the final transfer documents right now. Hand over the company and save your house. Or do not sign it, and I will formally instruct my lawyers to foreclose on your estate tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. You will be completely bankrupt and physically homeless by the end of the weekend. Your choice." The deafening silence in the grand boardroom was suddenly broken by the ragged, desperate sound of my father trying to pull oxygen into his rapidly constricting lungs. Harrison stared at the sleek silver pen resting on the polished mahogany table, his entire physical form trembling violently. A cold, suffocating sweat broke out across his forehead as a severe panic attack violently gripped his chest. The heavy, impenetrable wall of his patriarchal delusion finally collapsed, completely crushing him underneath its massive weight. In that agonizing moment, he was forced to swallow the absolute, bitter truth. He had possessed a brilliant, ruthlessly effective successor who could have propelled his empire to unprecedented global heights. But he had blindly discarded me entirely because of my gender, choosing instead to hand the keys to an incompetent, arrogant son simply because he carried the family name. His deeply ingrained misogyny had not just cost him a daughter, it had literally cost him his entire kingdom. Wheezing heavily, completely defeated and utterly broken, Harrison reached out with a violently shaking hand. He picked up the heavy pen and slowly, painfully, signed his name across the bottom of the final transfer document, legally surrendering every single ounce of his 40-year legacy directly to me. As the ink permanently dried on the contract, the horrific reality of their new existence violently detonated inside the room. Naomi stood frozen, staring at the signed document with wide, terrified eyes. The massive European vacations, the sprawling luxury estates, and the endless designer shopping sprees were officially dead. She slowly turned her head and looked at Cameron, who was slumped in his heavy leather chair, completely paralyzed by his own catastrophic failure. He was no longer a wealthy corporate executive. He was a broke, unemployed, completely disgraced man with zero actual marketable skills. Naomi did not utter a single word of comfort. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. She aggressively grabbed her left hand, violently twisting the massive multi-carat diamond wedding ring off her finger. With a sharp, furious motion, she hurled the heavy piece of jewelry directly at Cameron. The ring violently struck his chest and clattered loudly onto the polished floor. Naomi turned on her expensive heels and stormed out of the boardroom, abandoning her ruined husband without a single backward glance. The sharp slam of the heavy boardroom doors shattered whatever fragile composure Patricia had left. The pristine, elegant matriarch completely unraveled, dropping her expensive designer bag to the floor. She collapsed forward, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table, and broke down into loud, hysterical, ugly tears. Her carefully constructed facade of untouchable privilege completely melted away, leaving behind a terrified, desperate woman. She looked at me, her heavy makeup running down her cheeks, and began to pathetically beg for mercy. She pleaded with me to reconsider, crying out that we were family, that blood was supposed to mean something, and that they could not possibly survive this profound public humiliation. I sat perfectly still in the dominant executive chair, watching my parents completely disintegrate in front of me. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no joy, no sadness, and certainly not a single ounce of pity. I looked down at the signed contract, then met my mother's tear-soaked eyes with absolute freezing indifference. "You taught me that business is just business," I stated calmly, my voice completely void of any emotion. "You taught me that I was entirely disposable. Thank you for the lesson." I stood up from the heavy leather executive chair, the movement smooth and entirely unbothered. I reached across the polished mahogany wood and carefully picked up the signed contract, feeling the satisfying weight of the thick parchment between my fingers. I handed the document to Gideon, who swiftly locked it away inside his slim leather briefcase with a sharp, final click. I did not offer my parents a parting glance. I turned my back on the pathetic, weeping remnants of my toxic bloodline and walked directly toward the heavy double doors. The sound of Patricia sobbing uncontrollably echoed off the glass walls, mingling with the ragged, pathetic wheezing of my defeated father. Cameron remained completely silent in his chair, paralyzed by the sudden, violent death of his unearned arrogance. Their collective despair was the background music to my absolute victory, a symphony of their own making. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the pristine hallway, leaving the suffocating toxicity of that boardroom permanently behind me. My heels clicked rhythmically against the expensive marble floor, a steady, driving tempo that carried me toward the bank of elevators. When the silver doors glided shut perfectly, severing my visual connection to that floor, I finally allowed myself to take a deep, cleansing breath. The crushing, invisible weight I had carried since childhood, the heavy burden of constantly trying to prove my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me, completely evaporated. I rode the elevator down to the massive lobby, moving past the bustling crowds of corporate drones, feeling completely untouched by the chaos of the city. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped directly into the brilliant, blinding sunlight of the Friday morning. The air felt completely different on my skin. It was crisp, clean, and entirely mine. The heavy, suffocating shadows of the Harrison legacy could no longer touch me here. A sleek, black luxury sedan was idling smoothly at the curb. My private driver, a consummate professional who had been with me since the early days of my independent venture, immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear door. He offered a warm, respectful nod, a genuine gesture of professional courtesy that my family had never once managed to achieve. I slid into the plush leather interior, the quiet hum of the powerful engine, a stark contrast to the hysterical screaming I had just escaped. I instructed him to take me home, but I did not mean the cold, sprawling suburban mansion I had just legally acquired. I meant the true home I had built from absolutely nothing. The car glided seamlessly through the dense city traffic, the tinted windows shielding me from the glaring outside world. I watched the towering skyscrapers of the financial district blur past, reflecting on the sheer magnitude of what had just transpired. In less than a month, I had systematically dismantled a 40-year-old institution, using nothing but clean logic, airtight legal contracts, and superior technological infrastructure. I had weaponized their own greed against them, setting a trap so perfectly aligned with their inherent arrogance that they literally sprinted into it. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace settle deep into my bones. We pulled up to the sleek, modern glass structure that housed Apex Solutions. The building was a towering monument to relentless progress, completely devoid of the old world pretension that characterized my father's fallen empire. I stepped out of the luxury sedan and walked into the bustling, high-energy lobby. The security personnel greeted me by name, their respect earned through years of fair treatment and genuine leadership. I swiped my secure access card and rode the private elevator up to the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal the vibrant, thrumming heart of my $70 million enterprise. The space was a masterclass in modern corporate efficiency. There were no heavy, intimidating boardroom tables or archaic filing cabinets. The floor plan was entirely open, bathed in natural light and buzzing with the relentless momentum of genuine innovation. Rows of brilliant software engineers were rapidly deploying new updates to our proprietary logistics platforms. Strategic account managers were on high-definition video calls, securing massive international contracts that my father could only dream of landing. My team was a diverse, hungry, and incredibly lethal group of professionals. They were fiercely loyal to the vision we were building together. They did not answer to me because I was the heir to a predetermined throne. They followed me because I fought in the trenches alongside them, driving the company forward with unmatched precision. I walked past their workstations, offering brief nods of approval and reviewing real-time metric dashboards displayed on massive overhead screens. The company was completely thriving. We had absorbed the massive influx of market share left behind by the utter collapse of Harrison Logistics without missing a single beat. I entered my expansive, glass-enclosed corner office and dropped my bag onto the custom desk. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, watching the tiny cars move like ants on the streets below. I was finally completely free. The toxic anchor that had threatened to drown my potential had been permanently severed and left at the bottom of the ocean. I was the uncontested architect of my own massive success, answering to absolutely no one but myself. I turn away from the glass window, the narrative framing drops away, and I am now looking directly at you. We have reached the final chapter of this brutal, calculated journey, and I want you to internalize exactly what you just witnessed. Society constantly peddles this toxic narrative that we must endlessly forgive the people who share our DNA, that we must tolerate their abuse, their jealousy, and their aggressive mediocrity simply because of a biological accident. But you owe absolutely nothing to people who treat your brilliance as a threat. Never let anyone convince you to shrink yourself to fit their ego, especially not family. If they take away your seat at the table, buy the whole building and evict them. Have you ever had to legally outsmart a toxic family member? Tell me your story in the comments. And if you loved watching karma do its job, hit that like and subscribe button. There are always more empires to build, more battles to win, and I want you right here with me for the next massive move.